Seth, it's good to see you again. Thank you for coming to Viewpoints. We've worked together in the past at RAND, we've worked together here at MPS, but now you have quite a different job for the most part. And can you explain what that is, what you can tell us about it?
Sure, it actually relates directly to a lot of the work I've been doing at the Naval Postgraduate School at CHDS, which is focusing now, serving as Senior Advisor and Plans Officer for the Commanding General, U.S. Special Operations Forces, Afghanistan, based out of Afghanistan, and involved in creating strategy and plans for counterinsurgency operations in western, southern, and eastern Afghanistan.
It does actually fit with your comparative class from CHDS, actually.
Yeah.
Some of that research would probably play into what you're doing now.
Oh, it's a huge benefit because it's an ability I can leverage in that job work that I've done at CHDS on understanding the Al-Qaeda threat, understanding a range of interagency U.S. aspects for dealing with counterterrorism and counterinsurgency. So it actually dovetails quite well.
Post 9/11, immediately we all have these big questions about Afghanistan, but it's so far away and it's such a unique culture, and there have been so many other conflicts there. I'm wondering if you can broadly paint how Afghanistan fits into U.S. Homeland Security over the last 8 years.
And of course, it's probably helpful to start with the September 11th attacks, which took place with planning efforts by individuals like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed based out of Afghanistan. A range of the 9/11 attackers went through training in Afghanistan, and Afghanistan in general was critical for executing not just that attack, but in general providing a sanctuary for foreign fighters. Now, since that time period, we've seen a slight shift in those Al-Qaeda and foreign fighter networks from Afghanistan into Pakistan's tribal areas and into urban areas of Pakistan.
What they call the FATA.
The FATA, the federally administered tribal areas, right. So from a Homeland Security perspective, U.S. intelligence, for example, continues to indicate a very, very serious threat to the U.S. homeland coming from the Pakistani-Afghan border regions.
But Seth, if we've displaced Al-Qaeda to the FATA, then what is the issue with Afghanistan now? Why does that still play?
Well, I would say two reasons. One is that the location of key Al-Qaeda individuals are right along the Afghanistan border in the north and south Waziristan and Bajor.
I guess we have to remember it's not like the border between Arizona and California. This is a wild area.
It's a wild area, it's mountainous, so there is no actual fence there. And second of all, Al-Qaeda's relationship with the key Afghan insurgent groups, the Taliban, led by Mullah Muhammad Omar, and the Haqqani network, is very, very strong. Al-Qaeda has a very strong strategic, operational, and tactical level relationship with these groups, improves their ability to conduct suicide attacks and improvised explosive device attacks, propaganda training. So that link is actually stronger than it was with the Taliban, for example, before 9/11.
So clearly that relationship, that when we think about about Al-Qaeda and we think about Taliban, these are very different organizations, yet that link has grown much closer in recent years.
Well, it's grown closer. Just to use the example of suicide attacks. The Taliban in the 90s never used suicide attacks. It's something that's proliferated into the Afghan.
So AQ is having a big impact on the Taliban, let's say.
Absolutely.
And this would be Al-Qaeda Central.
This would be core Al-Qaeda Central. This would be individuals like Ayman al-Zawahiri, Abu al-Yasid, or Sheikh Saeed.
There's been a lot of discussion recently in some of the newspapers and foreign affairs and such about whether or not Al-Qaeda Central is still important or if it's self-emerging radicals. But what you're suggesting is that AQ, Al-Qaeda Central, still has an important role or still has an impact on those around them.
Well, there clearly are parts of the world where there are individuals motivated to attack, whether it's the United States or the UK, that have no direct connection to Al-Qaeda Central,
right.
that are purely homegrowns. But I would say the more sophisticated attacks and attempts we've seen, whether it's the 7/7 attacks in the UK, whether it's the transatlantic plot in 2007, whether it's the German the major German plot also in 2007, there was a direct connection to Al Qaeda in Pakistan, and with the German plot, there was a direct connection to Uzbek militant groups. So I would say with the more sophisticated plots, the ability to get training in Pakistan, to sort of religious ideological doctrination is actually helpful.
The Taliban is so much larger a group than Al Qaeda. If Al Qaeda is able to influence, and you're saying they are influencing them because they're now using tactics which before 9/11 they weren't using, the suicide attacks. That's pretty significant to Homeland Security people here in the United States, that they could have an even broader influence than they had prior to 9/11.
Well, what's interesting, or there are at least two components of this. One is we've seen suicide attacks proliferate from theater to theater, and we've seen it even move from the Afghan front to the Pakistani front. Does that mean that they could migrate to the U.S. Homeland Security front? Well, what we know is Al Qaeda strongly believes they were effective in targeting U.S. Infrastructure, both in the homeland as well as outside. The second issue that's of interest here, too, is Al Qaeda's propaganda role from a Homeland Security perspective. Their use of the internet, CDs and DVDs to indoctrinate and to increase recruitment is really quite fundamental, and has definitely impacted Homeland Security in the United States.
Let me switch gears slightly. I've heard analysis in the blogosphere and certainly on the cable news shows over the last few years, trying to relate what we're doing in Afghanistan to what the Russians did in Afghanistan. And, without a major history, not without being a major history buff, maybe people don't understand why they're different or if they're different. Can you kind of explain where we line up in our efforts there as opposed to what the Russians did for 20 years in Afghanistan?
Sure. I mean, the Russian effort in Afghanistan was largely a conventional operation. They used tanks, artillery, fixed-wing aircraft to essentially kill off Afghan insurgents. But the number of forces they had over 100,000 forces there, and they really operated on a conventional level. I would say the U.S. started off in 2001 fighting largely an unconventional war with really barely over 100 CIA and U.S. Special Operations forces leveraging Afghans. U.S. is then
quite different.
Then migrated to a more conventional
right.
Type of fight by increasing the number of conventional U.S. Army and then Marine Corps forces. And now there's an effort to slightly go back to at least the earlier effort by focusing on the Afghan population as the center of gravity. The other thing that's interesting to note about the Soviet period, which has very stark similarities to today, is the primary insurgent front that was targeting the Russians, so the Soviet army, was based out of Pakistan. It was 7 major mujahideen groups who had sanctuary and had direct support from Pakistan's intelligence service, from CIA, and from Saudi intelligence. What the U.S. faces now is a range of insurgent groups with sanctuary in Pakistan and with some state support from elements of Pakistan's intelligence service and Iranian Revolutionary Guards Quds Force.
Wow, from an international relations perspective, that's just a nightmare, isn't it?
It is.
On the one hand, we have who we've repeatedly said is our ally in this war against terrorism, or whatever we're calling it at this moment. On the other hand, elements of that same government working to kill U.S. soldiers and Marines.
Well, or at least willing to provide assistance to groups that
ultimately leading to,
in some cases, deaths of U.S. forces operators.
That's quite a difficult road to negotiate.
It creates very serious diplomatic issues.
Yes, I would bet. Most of our students, as you know, they're state, local, and federal people focused on a range of issues, but in this place, they're thinking about Homeland Security issues in the U.S. Would you talk a little more on how they're impacted by what you're doing there?
Sure. What we see on the Afghan-Pakistan front, and what I monitor on a regular basis, is the state of the insurgency, including foreign fighters operating from this area. And again, we continue to see a range of militant groups, not just Al-Qaeda, but Uzbek groups, and other groups with a global interest, and that is a willingness to conduct attacks against the homeland. So from a Homeland Security perspective, again, from a DHS perspective, from a state and local law enforcement, there continues to be a major threat to the homeland in areas that people sometimes forget about, and that is there's a major Pakistani population from the United Kingdom, which British intelligence has identified as a threat. So you have some individuals going to train in Pakistan, coming back to the United Kingdom. And remember, a lot of these European countries, including the UK, have visa waiver access to the United States. So the threat hits on multiple fronts. These are not just these sleeper cells in the U.S. This is an ability of groups to come into the United States through visa waiver.
Right, and for the EU, that's an even bigger problem, isn't it? For the European countries who are our allies, they get into one state easily, they can then move around without any problem whatsoever.
Right, as part of the Schengen Agreement, once you get into one area of the European Union, you have free access to other European countries.
It's nice to be free. It's also difficult to maintain security. So what's your prognosis for the future?
The focus of U.S. efforts has been to try and establish order from the top down, really from Kabul into rural areas, in a country with no history of a very strong central government. So what we're trying to do in the country, which will hopefully have an impact on Homeland Security, is focus on reaching out to local institutions, including tribes, sub-tribes, and clans. So
you're working through the tribes to really make a difference in their lives.
Because what we see when we go into rural areas is a lot of people hate the Taliban. They want to provide protection to their own communities. They want others, including the U.S., ultimately out of their areas. But if we can support them in providing security and delivering services at a very local level, there is a strong interest in a range of
places. They're the only game in town. It's no wonder that they're having to line up with them at some point.
So the Afghan central government is largely meaningless in rural areas of the country.
That's not unusual for a tribal area, though, really. We've seen that in a number of places in Central Asia and the Middle East.
And places like Somalia, too, yeah.
That tribal aspect.
So I'm, ultimately, I am hopeful that with a slightly different strategy that we can push back the Taliban and its related groups, including Al-Qaeda, and we can ultimately have a positive impact on U.S. security. And we're also being somewhat successful in the targeting of mid and upper level Al-Qaeda operatives in Pakistan through cooperation of the Pakistanis, including the Predator and Reaper strikes.
Outstanding. Well, you've got a lot of important work to do with relation to this strategy, and I wish you all the best. Thanks for taking your time to come talk to us today.
Thanks, Dave. Always a pleasure.
All right. Bye-bye.